There is an old Jewish saying or prayer or something that the Jewish men used to say. They would thank God for not making them Gentiles. And one of the other things, they would thank God for not making them a woman. And the whole thing about that was because women at that time couldn't study the Torah. They couldn't study the law. And so they were glad that God made them men, because that put a responsibility on their shoulders. And this is an announcement. This isn't part of my sermon, but if you were made a man, would you stand up, please? What are you questioning it? You don't have to understand that? Wow! Some of you looking at your wives like, does that mean me? This is going to kind of prove my point here. Men, we have a responsibility. We were created by God as men to do what men are called to do. Lead His church, lead our families, pray for our families, pray for our church, and serve Him as men. And I think what just happened was a great example. I think, guys, sometimes our world has taught us that maybe we're not quite men. And so we are starting to do some more men's activities here. And you can sit down now, because now I want you to sit down and get out a piece of paper and write down this date for me. That on Saturday, September the 28th, we men will be gathering out at our property in Rock Island for a men's prayer breakfast. Now, I haven't set the time of it yet. It will probably be 8 or 9 o'clock that morning, but I want you to make sure that you don't have anything else scheduled that morning and plan on being there, because we men need to start doing more of this stuff together. We need to start praying more together. It needs to be where when I say, if you were a man here, stand up, and you guys just jump. All right? Anyway, just wanted to make that announcement. Hopefully that will stick in your heads. Now I want to talk about what Daniel was saying earlier, just rest. Isn't that, like Daniel said, isn't that an awesome thought? Just rest. Not just closing your eyes, but in biblical terms, when it talks about rest, it is a rest that is in response to what God has done. In a way, it's kind of a surrender of myself to know that I don't have to do anything, because God is God and God is in control. The Sabbath day was to be a day of rest. And I want us to look this morning at God's commandments regarding the Sabbath. The first one is in Exodus chapter 20. It says, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And on it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservants, or your animals, or the aliens within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, but He rested on the seventh day. And therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and He made it holy." You know, and the whole thing behind this is God created everything in 6 days and could take a break. And so you can do all of your stuff in 6 days and take a break. Amen? Okay. And He wanted you to do this, to have this day of rest in reflection on the fact that He was in control. He'd taken care of everything. And it was done. Take your rest. Later, as the people are crossing over to take possession of the land God had promised, He gives them the law again, and He says here in Deuteronomy chapter 5, "Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Now, holy means separate, not like the other days. Keep it holy as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And on it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your ox, your donkey, or any other of your animals, nor the alien within your gates, so that your manservants and maidservants may rest, as you do. And remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. You know, when you lived in Egypt, the world, the earthly powers, they want you to work day after day after day after day after day. But you don't belong to this world anymore. God says, you belong to me. And I delivered you out of that world so that you're not bound by that world anymore. I brought you out to give you a day of rest. A day that you don't have to depend on your own labor. You don't have to depend on the things of the world. It's a day of rest. A day not to do any more work. Now the question comes up, well, what defines work? What defines labor? You see, in the Old Testament, there are only a very few passages that specifically define what was work that couldn't be done in regards to the Sabbath day. One of them was in Exodus chapter 35, verse 2 and 3. For 6 days work is to be done, but the seventh day shall be your holy day, a Sabbath rest to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it, listen to this, church, whoever does any work on it must be put to death. Do not light a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day. Why not build a fire on the Sabbath day? Because it's work. Is it work building the fire, or will the fire lead them to do work? What will they do with the fire? Cook. So is cooking work? If they don't cook on the Sabbath, how are they to eat? Well, the Lord kind of provides. So, don't build a fire. Don't cook on the Sabbath. I don't know. Again, can you cut the fire? Can you strike the match? Can you strike the stone? Can you do whatever makes the spark? Is that the problem? Or is the problem what the fire makes you do, which is cook food? Don't know. Another one in Exodus 34, verse 21. 6 days you shall labor, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Even during the plowing season and the harvest season, you must rest. Now that one is pretty clear and straightforward, I think. You can't plow. You can't harvest on the Sabbath day. You have to rest. Maybe that's because God wants them to know that He's going to provide for them, whether they're planting or plowing or harvesting on those days. They can take it easy. God's going to take care of them. But how do you define harvest? If you walk out, if a farmer walks out that day and is looking at his crops and wants to give praise to God for what He's provided for him, and he takes a seed of grain and he peels it apart and pulls a little head off to see how beautiful that is that harvesting? Or is harvesting when you go through with a sickle and you cut it all down to thresh it? Is harvesting taking any seed or any part of grain off, or is harvesting getting it to sell and produce? Jeremiah chapter 17. This is what the Lord says. Be careful not to carry a load on the Sabbath day, or bring it through the gates of Jerusalem. Do not bring a load out of your houses, or do any work on the Sabbath, but keep the Sabbath day holy as I commanded your forefathers. How much is a load? You guys just have these blank expressions on your faces. Isaiah 58, verse 13. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on the holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, so your feet have to keep the Sabbath. Can you tap your toes to a song on the Sabbath? Can you walk someplace you want to go? Because it says, going your own way, doing as you please. Those are the places that the Scriptures that's as clear as they get. Now, when the Jews went into captivity, especially into the Babylonian captivity, many of the Jewish leaders decided that the reason God had let them go into captivity and delivered them into bondage is because God had given these rules and these laws, but they hadn't kept them very well. They had gotten lax in some of this stuff. They would do stuff on the Sabbath that God didn't approve of. But then how do you define what constitutes work and what constitutes labor? And so the Jewish leaders, when they came out of Babylon, they had come up with 39 distinct categories, and each category had its own little subsections that specifically laid out what actions constituted work. Now remember, God had given the Sabbath as a day of rest, a day to sit and reflect on who is your provider, who takes care of you, and your relationship with Him, and to just spend that day just calmly in the peace and the joy of His presence. Rest. That's what it was intended for. But what the Jewish leaders had turned it into was something that was burdensome and oppressive, and it led to worry and fret, and am I doing this right or not? I want to give you just kind of a simple, exaggerated illustration of this morning. What I want you to do right now is I want you to take a deep breath. I didn't even hear anything. Take a deep breath, blow it out, and rest. I want you to just rest. Take a moment and rest. But don't think about resting, because that would require your mind to be working, and so don't think about it. I don't want you to think about a beautiful field or a bubbling stream or mountains, because that might make you think about walking, which is not restful. So don't think about that. But rest, okay? Rest. Don't lean your head forward, because that requires muscles to pull your head forward, and it'll require muscles to lift it back. Don't lean your head back, okay, because that requires muscles. So I want you to sit and rest, but I don't want you to move your head. Don't close your eyes, because that takes muscles to close your eyes, and then you may fall asleep, and that's not the kind of rest that we want. But don't open your eyes, because then you'll have to blink, okay? That's work. So let your eyes find that middle spot, because if you blink, that's work. If you close your eyes, that's work. And either of those are a violation of rest. Don't think about resting, okay? No thinking. Now, in that relaxed state where your head is neither forward nor back, your shoulders are neither relaxed all the way down or lifted all the way up, your eyes are neither closed nor open, and you're not thinking about resting, you're not thinking about any of this, I want you to just stop breathing. Because that requires muscles also. And when you get to where you can attain this state of rest for an entire day, now you have honored God. Now doesn't that feel restful? Don't you all feel so much better now? Or did you get a little stressed and start saying, Lance, would you shut up? I'm trying to rest. And that's kind of the way it was with what the leaders of the Jews had brought back on their Sabbath stuff. It wasn't a day of rest. It was a day of law keeping and a day of all of the things that you must be doing on this day and all the things that you cannot be doing. And knowing that somebody was watching every move that you made. That if in your house you happened to walk by and you saw something on the floor, maybe a stalk of grass from your broom had blown off and you reached down to pick it up and somebody was going to say, "Ah!" That's what they had turned the Sabbath into. But last week we saw that Jesus had just called all the weary and all the burdened to Him that they might find rest. Rest that He would give them. Rest to the burdens of the yoke of the legal experts in the Jewish law. So open your Bibles this morning. Matthew chapter 12. It's on page 689 in your pew Bibles. Because what Jesus had called the people last week, Matthew chapter 11, to come to Him. This week in Matthew chapter 12, we see stories that really contrast the burden and the yoke of the Pharisees and the religious leaders with Jesus. In chapter 12, beginning in verse 1, it says, "At that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath.' And he answered, 'Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple desecrate the day and yet are innocent? I tell you, there's something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." I want to take a moment here and look at what this shows us about the Pharisees and what this shows us about Jesus, or what Jesus is trying to teach. First of all, about the Pharisees, it tells us that they were more focused on the law and law-keeping than they were on people. The second thing is that they claimed to be experts in the Scriptures. And they knew the Scriptures, but what we see and what Jesus points out to them is they did not know the heart of the God of those Scriptures. They totally missed that point. Another thing that's kind of a side observation, I've always wondered about this. They had created all of these laws to keep the people from breaking the law, so God would be pleased with them and not send them into captivity, and yet they were under Roman rule and oppression. Even though they were doing all these laws and all these rules. You see, I think they, kind of like us, we sometimes don't even see the weaknesses of our own arguments. You know, we've got to do it this way or God's not going to be happy with us and lead us into bondage. And you said, you already are in bondage. Oh yeah, but we're pretending we're not. We're still pleasing God here. Anyway, that's a side note. But what is Jesus teaching here in this? Well, first of all, Jesus is teaching that God's will provides exceptions in the law. Now, notice that. God's will, God's desire, God's plan provides for exceptions in the law. You see, what Jesus says is it was more important for David and his companions to eat than it was for them to observe the Sabbath, about not picking grain. It was more important that they be fed than observe the temple law. And that's because David and his companions had a very important role to play in God's purpose and in God's kingdom. Now, you can go back into 1 Samuel chapter 21, and that's where this story that Jesus brings out comes from. David has been anointed the king, but he hasn't been enthroned yet. God has chosen David to be the king, and he will be the king, But Saul is still wearing the crown, and Saul is out to destroy David. He's pursuing him for the purpose of killing him. But God's plan is for David to be on the throne. And so David and his companions are running from Saul. They're hungry, they're without food, and they go in, and the only thing to eat is the consecrated bread that's only allowed to be eaten by the priests. And they eat it. And God is okay with that, because it fits in with His plan. We also see that, in the temple, it's more important for the priests to work on the Sabbath. Do they need fires for the sacrifice? Yes. Somebody has to build those fires? Yes. Do animals need to be slaughtered? Yes. Do loads need to be carried on the Sabbath because the sacrifices have to be lifted and placed on the altar? Yes. So the priests have to work on the Sabbath, right? And God says that's okay, because my will supersedes the law and makes provisions for exceptions in the law. And now Jesus says in verse 6, I tell you that something, most of your translations are going to say that one. The Greek word there is most often translated something, and I think it fits better if we say something greater than the temple is here, because what's greater than the temple is Jesus and His disciples and His ministry. Just like David and his companions were important for God's plan, well, Jesus and His disciples are even greater. Something even greater than David is here. Something even greater than the temple is here. And if God will allow for exceptions to His law then, certainly He will allow exceptions to His law now. And so Jesus reveals their lack of understanding about the heart of God. God says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And keeping all of these rules meant that they excluded the weary, they excluded the burdened, they excluded the poor, they excluded the sick, they excluded the aliens. And Jesus points out to me that is never what God's law was intended for. So now we have the second example, beginning in verse 9. Going on from that place, Jesus went into their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there, looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. They asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And he said to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out, and they plotted how they might kill Jesus. Now, I don't know about you, but when you read this, to me, this was a setup. I personally think that they had that guy with the shriveled hand come to the synagogue just so they could put Jesus to the test. Look at their question for him. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Look at Jesus' answer down in verse 12. It's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Jesus knew their question wasn't just about healing. It was about doing good. Is it okay to do good on the Sabbath? And you can imagine, their question really to Jesus was, is it okay to do good on the Sabbath? Like the answer was going to be, no, you have to do all bad on the Sabbath. And it's kind of absurd, their question was. But the way they interpreted the law, and this is what we see here about the Pharisees, they had established a system in their laws that unless it was a life-threatening condition, all healing had to be postponed till after the Sabbath day. You came in blind and there was somebody there that could heal you. Well, if it's not life-threatening, you're going to have to come back tomorrow. You come in deaf, you come in demon-possessed with a shriveled hand covered with leprosy, and here is someone who can cure you, heal you, make you whole again. And the way the law was no, you have to come back tomorrow. And Jesus teaches, using their own actions, that was absurd. He said, if you guys have a sheep and it falls into a pit, you pull it out. Because that's a good thing to do. And a man is more valuable than a sheep. So yes, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And since now Jesus has defied their laws and He's shown the ignorance of their laws, they set out to kill Him. And I want to point that out here because from this point on in Matthew's Gospel, everything we read under the shadow of the cross. Because that's where Jesus is headed. And so now we see, beginning in verse 15, Jesus moves on from there. He doesn't leave because they're trying to kill Him. He leaves because of who He is and the mission that He has. In verse 15, aware of this, aware that they were trying to kill Him, Jesus withdrew from that place. And many followed Him, and He healed all their sick, warning them not to tell who He was. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant, whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, till he leads justice to victory. In his name, the nations will put their hope. Excuse me. Jesus was chosen by God for a specific purpose, which was to proclaim justice to the nations, to all the nations, to make things right with God. The legal experts had created things that excluded people and didn't bring justice as God sees justice. But what we see about Jesus in verse 19, we see that Jesus is not going to argue with those guys. He's not going to stand there and start a battle with them. It says He's not going to quarrel or cry out. No one will hear His voice in the streets. We also see in verse 20, just like Jesus said up in chapter 11, verse 29, that He is gentle and humble in heart. Because it says, a bruised reed He will not break, and a smoldering wick He will not snuff out. And I want you to think about all the laws and the regulations that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law had established. Somebody who was a bruised reed, somebody who was broken and hurt and desiring to be in a right relationship with God, who happened to stop and pick up something off the floor in the house one night. And rather than seeing that person as a bruised reed that needed tender, loving care and compassion, they just squashed him like a bug. But not Jesus. Jesus is gentle. And therefore, Jesus brings hope to the nations. Because He doesn't reject everybody who's messed up and not done it all perfectly. He brings true freedom and true justice. He reveals the heart of God. The Jewish legal experts had it backwards. They saw God as a loving God, but He only loved those who kept His law perfectly. Those who did all of the right things, yes, those were the ones loved by God. In some ways, it was as if they had to earn God's love. It was only by following all the rules that you were identified as the true people of God, and only then would God love you and protect you and welcome you. But Jesus calls for the broken and the sick and those who haven't done it all perfectly. He calls for sinners to come to Him. He calls them to lay down their burdens, to take up His yoke, to follow Him in love and in service to others. He says that He will give them rest. They don't have to earn it. He'll give it to them. You know, every so often I have people ask me, Lance, what does it take to join your church? My first answer is, it's not my church. Okay? It's the Lord's church. Now, if you want to know what it takes to join His church, I'll tell you about that. And I know that probably what they're thinking is the same thing that people would see from the Pharisees. You know, what are the rules? What do I have to do to be a part of this church? You know, I mean, do I have to sign a commitment card that I'm going to be there X number of services per month? Do I have to sign a pledge card saying that I'll give X% of my salary for, you know, the rest of my life? You know, do I have to sign up to be a part of specific ministries within the church? You know, do I have to renounce publicly certain things and all? Is that the kind of stuff that I have to do to join your church? But Jesus kind of answered this. We saw this last week. Jesus says to people who want to become a part of His church, He says, come to me. Come to me. All you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. In Acts chapter 2, we read about a group of Jews who were gathered together. People who had been in bondage by the law for years, and finally that oppressive, legalistic view of the law led them to crucify Jesus. And after His resurrection, Peter and the other 12 are there proclaiming to these people what they've done, who they crucified, that their legalistic view of keeping the law and condemning everyone who didn't keep the law, that had led them to kill Jesus. One that God had revealed was His chosen one. And when those people came to understand that, they said, you know, what do we do? And so Peter replied to them, repent, be baptized. And church, I want to suggest to you that that is what Jesus means when He says, come to me. Leave your old life and come to Him. And be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ, so that your sins may be forgiven, unburdened. Leaving that burden that you've been carrying for all of these years, leaving it there, and now being clothed with something new. You'll receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. Something that will help carry your load. And the promise is for you and your children, for all who are far off, for all whom the Lord our God will call. And with many other words He warned them, He pleaded with them, save yourselves from this corrupt generation. And those who accepted His message were baptized. And about 3,000 were added to their number that day. So, what does it take to join the church? Well, you come to Jesus and you take His yoke. You confess Him as your Lord. You turn your old, sinful, burdened life over to Him. And you have all of that washed away through baptism. And then God gives you His Spirit, your new burden, your new yoke. And then He adds you to His church. This morning, Jesus calls you to leave all man-made rules, all man-made religious doctrines, all man-made oppressive laws. He calls you to leave all of that and to come to Him. to let Him unburden you, to let Him teach you, and to let Him add you to His church. If you've never done that, then He's calling you this morning. Come to me. If you need this morning to come to Jesus, to begin that new life, we're going to stand and we're going to sing a song. We call it our invitation song, but it's actually His invitation song, as He is the one inviting you this morning to come to Him, all you who are weary and burdened. He will give you rest. This morning, if you need to do so, please come while we stand and sing.